I grew up in Chicago, Illinois, in a red brick Georgian house on Hawthorne Avenue. It looked like every dream families wanted to copy: white columns, blue shutters, and a manicured front yard where hydrangeas bloomed perfectly in sync each spring. My mother, Vivian, waved from the porch every morning as if she were in a magazine shoot, and my father, Charles, jogged down the block in his neatly pressed tracksuit, nodding to the neighbors like a local politician. My older brother, Lucas, had a voice that carried across lawns, and my younger sister, Naomi, collected likes online faster than any of us could blink. To outsiders, we were a portrait of success, an American story framed in glossy perfection. Inside, I was the quiet one. My name is Mara, the invisible thread holding everything together. After college, I stayed in Chicago and took a job as a financial analyst downtown. It paid decently, but not extravagantly. I rented a small one-bedroom apartment above a bakery and convinced myself I liked the smell of croissants more than I minded the noise of early mornings. Each month, I sent money to my parents when bills unexpectedly piled up. When Lucas's third business idea collapsed, I transferred $2,000 to help him reset. When Naomi's roommate disappeared without notice, I covered her rent deposit so her social calendar wouldn't suffer. I told myself it was love, that family helped each other, that my turn would come. It never did. When my father's dream of opening a fine dining restaurant began to falter, I stepped in again. He had already invested $140,000 from his retirement and a second mortgage on the house. My mother called one evening with her polished tone, saying, "Your father just needs a little push to get it open." That little push turned into $80,000 in personal loans under my name. I turned my side consulting work into an official LLC, convincing myself it was an investment in family legacy. I drafted every document carefully: my name, my control, my risk. Love with clauses. Trust with receipts. When the restaurant finally opened in River North, it was breathtaking. Warm brick walls, floor-to-ceiling windows, white oak tables that gleamed under amber light. My mother wore pearls at the ribbon cutting, Lucas gave a dramatic speech about our shared vision, and Naomi filled her phone with photos that made everything look effortless. I stood near the back, half smiling, half calculating. The truth was, the place looked like success because I had funded the illusion. For the first 6 months, the restaurant limped forward. Payroll ran short every other Friday, suppliers demanded payment faster than the dining crowd could grow, and every emergency landed quietly in my inbox. I wired money at midnight, moved balances, and juggled deadlines like a one-woman finance department. To keep up, I sold my car, moved into a smaller apartment in Logan Square, and switched to instant noodles for dinner. My parents never noticed. They sent photos of brunches and charity galas, still wearing the same smiles that said, "We're doing great." Whenever people praised our family's unity, I smiled too. They saw a home built on harmony, not realizing it was standing on my exhaustion. The restaurant generated buzz in the city, but the profits went straight into paying off old debts. I kept quiet. I told myself that real love sometimes meant staying invisible. I remember one night standing in our family kitchen, staring through the wide window at the garden lights. Everything looked perfect, manicured, symmetrical, unbothered. My mother's crystal vases lined the counter, catching reflections of the warm bulbs above. But all I could feel was the weight of being unseen. I couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked how I was doing. When I brought groceries, they called me thoughtful. When I transferred money, they called me dependable. No one asked if I ever got tired of saving them. That night, Lucas showed up unannounced, talking about a new tech startup he wanted to launch. He asked if I could just back him for the first phase. I laughed softly, maybe too softly. I told him I didn't have more to give. His smile vanished, replaced by the same quiet disappointment I'd seen on my parents' faces whenever I wasn't immediately useful. I knew then that my worth existed only in what I provided. I walked upstairs to my old room. It was still arranged as if I were 16, soft pink walls, framed photos from school, and a shelf of trophies that meant something once. I sat on the edge of the bed and thought about every time I'd sacrificed, every dinner skipped, every bill delayed, every dream postponed. I didn't cry. I just felt a strange, heavy calm, like the moment before a storm finally breaks. Before leaving that night, I paused at the front door. My mother was laughing in the living room, my father on his laptop reviewing restaurant schedules, Naomi texting by the window. They looked peaceful, untouched by the chaos behind their smiles. The house smelled like lemon polish and expensive candles. Everything gleamed. And for the first time, I saw it clearly, not a home, but a showroom built on quiet sacrifices no one would ever acknowledge. I drove back to my apartment under the glow of streetlights, the city blurring past my windshield. I replayed every moment of the evening, each demand disguised as love. I realized I had been feeding a machine that would never stop taking. My phone buzzed, another message from my mother reminding me about next month's loan payment due for the restaurant. I didn't answer. That night, I opened my laptop, pulled up my business accounts, and stared at the numbers that kept them alive. I thought about the legal structure I had created, the clauses that gave me quite control. For years, I had used those controls to protect them. I wondered, for the first time, what would happen if I used them to defend myself. The thought startled me, but it didn't fade. It stayed with me as I brushed my teeth, as I climbed into bed, as the hum of the city quieted outside. I didn't know it then, but that was the night everything began to shift. The cracks in the perfect picture had been there all along. I had just finally stopped pretending they were reflections of light. It was a Tuesday evening when everything finally snapped into clarity. I had just finished washing a mug when my phone lit up on the counter. The message was short, clinical, cold, like it had been rehearsed. Don't call or come over. We're done. And don't even think about the will. It was from my mother. The water kept running long after I'd stopped moving. For a few seconds, I just stared at the glowing screen, waiting for something else, an explanation, a joke, a second message that would undo the first. Nothing came. I dried my hands slowly and typed 2 words back. Got it. Silence pressed against the walls. The apartment suddenly felt smaller, heavier. I pulled out a chair at my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and stared at the spreadsheet that had quietly kept our family's empire from collapsing. Numbers had always told me the truth when people wouldn't. Tonight, I was ready to listen. For years, I had been their safety net. When the restaurant's payroll ran short, I covered it through a revolving credit line under my company. When suppliers demanded immediate payments, I used my emergency vendor account to smooth things over. When the equipment broke, I used a secured business card I'd personally guaranteed. Every dollar, every account, every transfer had my signature. My family had built their comfort on the structure I'd quietly designed beneath them. Now, with one message, they had cut the cord and they didn't realize I was the current running through their system. I took a long breath, opened the first portal to my business bank, and began to shut the switches. One by one. The revolving line of credit? Revoked. ACH permissions for payroll? Removed. Vendor account? Closed with a final balance of 0. Secured business card? Frozen permanently. Each click felt like lifting a weight from my ribs. I printed confirmations, signed them neatly, and slid them into a leather folder I'd bought years ago for important family files. Tonight, it was for something else. Peace. At 9:55 p.m., I opened a new email to Julia Ramirez, the restaurant's accountant. The subject line read, Transition of support. My fingers moved fast, calm, deliberate. Effective tonight, my company will no longer provide bridge funding, payroll float, or emergency coverage. All balances I control are settled. All permissions I granted are withdrawn. Please coordinate directly with ownership for any future operations. Contact me only for closure-related signatures. Thank you. No drama. No explanation. Just business. By 10:30, I had drafted another message to the suppliers, people who had called me instead of my father whenever an invoice hung in limbo. The message was polite, professional, and final. I attached the paid receipts and proof that every transaction tied to my name was clean. At 11:04, I shut the laptop. The hum of the city outside filled the silence. I poured peppermint tea into the mug that had started it all and sat by the window. For the first time in years, I didn't feel responsible for anyone else's survival. I slept deeply that night, dreamless and still. The next morning, sunlight slipped through the blinds and woke me early. My phone showed 13 missed calls from my father, 4 from my mother, and 2 from Lucas. No one left a voicemail. I brushed my hair, slipped into a navy blazer, and walked out the door. At lunch, I went to the bank to close the last account, a personal savings account I'd labeled Family Emergencies. It had bailed out everything from hospital bills to Naomi's wedding deposit. The teller, a young man with kind eyes, asked if I wanted to leave $1 to keep it open just in case. I smiled. No, close it entirely. When I stepped outside into the Chicago sunlight, the air felt cleaner, the light sharper. By afternoon, the silence began to break. First came a call from my father, his voice low and tight. "We can't process payroll," he said, skipping greetings. "The system's rejecting our transfers." "That's because the accounts were under my company," I replied evenly. "They're closed." "What do you mean, closed?" "I mean, I'm no longer funding the restaurant." There was a pause, a long, heavy one where pride wrestled with panic. "You can't just do that." "I just did." He muttered something about family loyalty, about timing, about how I should have warned them. I didn't answer. I simply said, "You made it clear last night that we're done." "I'm honoring that." Then I ended the call. An hour later, my mother's messages arrived. Paragraphs of accusations. How could I, after all they'd done, after every sacrifice they'd made for me? She didn't mention the years of my silent financial triad. She didn't mention the bills I paid, or the nights I stayed up balancing her husband's missteps. To her, I had become ungrateful. That word, ungrateful, was the final confirmation I needed. I spent the rest of the day wrapping up what was left of my shared ties. I logged into the state's business portal and removed my father's name as an associate on my LLC. I deleted shared folders, changed passwords, and updated bank alerts. Everything that once connected us in finances was now cleanly severed. By sunset, I made one last call to Julia. She answered on the first ring. "I receive your email," she said. "I assume this isn't temporary?" "It's permanent," I replied. "They'll need to manage without me." There was a moment of silence, then a soft sigh. "Honestly, I'm proud of you. It's about time they learned who's been holding the net." Her words hit deeper than I expected. I thanked her and wished her luck. When I hung up, the city outside was glowing in the orange wash of evening traffic. That night, I walked to the lakefront, my steps steady against the cool wind. The waves were dark and restless, but they moved with purpose, free, endless, untamed. I watched them and felt something similar stirring inside me. Not anger, not revenge, just a clean break between who I'd been and who I was becoming. For years, I had been the quiet one, the fixer, the buffer, the invisible current that powered their illusion. But now, the current was gone. The lights in their perfect world would flicker soon, not out of cruelty, but truth. When I returned home, I made tea again, the same peppermint blend, the same mug. I sat at the same table where I had started the night before. But everything felt different now. The quiet wasn't heavy, it was earned. I thought of their faces when they realized the safety net was gone. The shock, the scrambling, the silence that would follow. For once, I didn't need to see it. I didn't crave the satisfaction. I just wanted to rest. And so I did. By Friday, the cracks that had been quietly forming finally split wide open. The restaurant missed payroll for the first time since it opened, and panic rippled through the family like a cold wind. I woke to a string of missed calls and voice messages. The first was from Lucas, his voice laced with irritation, pretending to be authoritative. "You can't just walk away like this, Mara. We have staff waiting on checks. You're making us look bad." The next was from my mother. "Your father is furious. I don't know what's gotten into you, but this isn't how family behaves. We trusted you." And then my father's text. "Come to the house and explain yourself." 7 words that read less like an invitation and more like a summons. I didn't go. Instead, I drove to River North and parked across from the restaurant. Inside, I could see the staff moving with tension that wasn't there before. Julia Ramirez, the accountant, met me in the small office behind the kitchen. She handed me a paper cup of coffee, her face calm but tired. "They're trying to fix this the wrong way," she said. "But you already know that." We sat together while she opened a binder filled with numbers, invoices, and account logs. "Here's the truth," she said, tapping the pages with her pen. "They could run this place on their own if they made smart cuts, get rid of the private driver, renegotiate the seafood supplier, and drop 2 of the luxury wine allocations. They've been overspending because you always covered the gaps." I stared at the pages. The math was simple, but the habit was the problem. My family had built an entire lifestyle on the assumption that I would catch every fall before it hit the floor. Around 3 p.m., a supplier arrived, asking for a check. Normally, he'd have one within an hour. But this time, my father had to face him. I stood quietly near the kitchen door as the conversation turned sharp, then awkwardly quiet. My father's voice, once commanding, now carried the strain of someone realizing the ground beneath him was thinner than he thought. At 4:15, I handed Julia my office key. "You'll be fine without me," I said. She nodded. "We'll survive," she replied. "Maybe now they'll finally learn how to." I hugged her before leaving. There was no anger left in me, just space, as if every burden I'd been carrying had quietly stepped off my shoulders. That night, the house on Hawthorne Avenue filled with voices. I wasn't there, but I could imagine it perfectly. My father paced the living room, phone pressed to his ear, calling investors who wouldn't answer. My mother is sitting at the kitchen island, spinning stories about ungrateful children to anyone who'd listen. Lucas is trying to fix things by making promises he can't fund. Naomi is crying into her phone, posting cryptic lines about betrayal and envy. The house that had once gleamed under golden light was now just a stage with its curtains ripped open. Every whisper, every judgment, every carefully rehearsed line about unity and class collapsed under its own weight. 2 weeks later, the house went on the market. I found the listing online while scrolling during lunch. The photos looked just like a memory pretending to be new. The columns stood proud, the white shutters bright. The kitchen island gleamed as though nothing had ever gone wrong. The caption read, "Classic charm with modern upgrades." I bookmarked the page for a second, then closed it. That house had never been a home. It was a museum built from denial, polished with my sacrifices. For years, I had been the quiet scaffolding that kept it standing. Now, stripped of my support, it had to face the weight of its own foundation. News traveled quickly through our circle of friends and extended family. Some called to ask what had happened. I told them only fragments. "I stopped paying for things that weren't mine anymore," I'd say. Or, "Sometimes you have to step back for peace." It was the truth, small and clean. They'd pause, unsure what to say, before offering sympathy that sounded half like curiosity. People loved to whisper about the collapse of a perfect family. It gave them comfort, as if perfection were always fragile. In the evenings, I walked along the lake, breathing in the cold air and watching the city lights stretch across the water. I thought about how quiet my life had become. No late-night calls for help, no surprise bills, no guilt when I said no. The silence wasn't lonely, it was freedom. One rainy Thursday, I began packing. For boxes were all I needed. Clothes. A few favorite books. A framed photo of the lake at Montrose Harbor, where the light always seemed kinder. And at the bottom of the last box, the folder of confirmations I had printed that night. The proof of every account I'd closed, every tie I'd cut. When I sealed the box with tape, I sat on the floor for a moment, surrounded by half-empty shelves and the soft hum of rain against the windows. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel regret. Just a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes you have to let something fall to see what it was really built on. Before bed, I checked the house listing again. The price had dropped by $200,000. I imagined potential buyers walking through those perfect rooms, commenting on how beautiful the kitchen was, how bright the windows were. None of them would know what it cost to keep that light shining for so long. That night, I slept without my phone near the bed. No buzzing, no pleading messages, No guilt tugging at the edges of my rest. Just the sound of rain and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. When morning came, I made coffee and opened the window. The city smelled new. Somewhere behind me, the remnants of a family empire were unraveling, bank accounts frozen, credit calls unanswered, pride meeting its own mirror. But I didn't need to see it. I had already lived through the quiet crumble. The house that didn't hold had finally let go. And so had I. The day I left Chicago, the city skyline looked softer than usual, like a memory fading around the edges. I loaded the last box into the trunk of my old sedan, double-checked the locks, and turned the key in the ignition. The air was cool, the streets half empty. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. There was no need. This wasn't the disappearance. It was a quiet return to myself. I drove north with the windows cracked and the radio low. The highway stretched out like a long sigh, carrying me away from years of noise I hadn't realized I'd been living in. The further I went, the lighter the air felt. The constant buzz of obligation began to dissolve behind me, replaced by the kind of silence that doesn't ask for anything. By evening, I reached a small coastal town in Maine. The lease papers for a cedar-shingled cottage had been sitting in my glove compartment for weeks, signed and sealed. The rent was modest, the kind that didn't come with expectations. The key waited in a lockbox beside the porch, just like the owner promised. When I stepped inside, the smell of salt and pine filled the room. The furniture was simple, just a small table, 2 chairs, and a couch by the window that faced the sea. It was perfect. I unpacked my 4 boxes and lined them along the wall. Clothes, a few books, kitchen essentials, and the leather folder that held the final traces of my old life. Bank closures, legal documents, receipts that marked the end of one story and the start of another. I made a cup of tea and stood by the window, watching the last light fade over the gray water. Seagulls traced slow arcs across the sky. For the first time in years, I didn't feel behind on anything. The next morning, I woke without an alarm. The rhythm of the waves was enough. I made coffee, walked barefoot to the porch, and breathed in the sea air until the chill bit at my skin. My phone buzzed once, then again, but I didn't reach for it. Whatever waited on the screen could wait a lifetime. Over the next week, I built new routines. I walked the narrow path by the water every morning, sometimes collecting sea glass, sometimes just listening to the surf. I cooked real meals, roasted vegetables, baked bread, things that filled the air with warmth instead of anxiety. I wrote a small note on a white card and taped it to the fridge. You do not have to be needed to be worthy. Every time I opened the door, those words reminded me why I'd come. On Friday, I opened a savings account at a local bank under only my name. The first deposit was small, just a few $100s, but it was mine. I set an automatic transfer to move a little each week, not for anyone's emergencies, not for rescue plans or restaurant payrolls. For me, the feeling wasn't pride exactly. It was peace shaped like responsibility. I found a therapist in Portland who specialized in recovery from family enmeshment. I called, booked an appointment, and 2 days later sat in a small, sunlit office facing a woman with kind eyes. I told her the truth. The whole truth, for the first time in years. Not the polished version I'd learned to tell. Not the efficient one that made people comfortable. Just the raw, uneven story of how I kept giving until there was nothing left of me. She didn't interrupt. She just listened. When I finished, she said softly, "You finally stopped mistaking sacrifice for love." The words stayed with me. Messages still came, though less often now. Some were sharp, full of blame. Others were soft, testing the waters of reconciliation. I didn't reply, not out of anger, but because there was nothing left to explain. The silence between us wasn't cruel, it was clean. One message, however, I did open. It was from Julia Ramirez, the restaurant accountant. "Hi Mara, just wanted to let you know, the restaurant's doing fine. They finally cut waste, negotiated with suppliers, and figured out payroll. It's running lean, but it's stable. They learned to stand without help. Thought you'd want to know." I smiled at the screen for a long time before replying. "Good. That's how it should be." Then I turned my phone face down and returned to my tea. Later that afternoon, I decided to sort through the last folder of papers from Chicago. Letters, closure confirmations, and the final budget I'd written 3 years ago. The handwriting was neat, the arrows precise, every line filled with care. I ran my fingers over the ink and realized how much love had lived in those numbers, not for money, but for people I believed in. I didn't tear it up. I folded it gently and tucked it back inside. It belonged to a version of me who had done her best. By late summer, the cottage felt like home. I bought a small plant for the porch from a woman named Elise at the local hardware store. She helped me pick it out, chatting about the tides and the way storms rolled in without warning. When she asked why I'd moved to Maine, I said, I needed a life that fit my actual heart. She smiled like she understood. That night, I sat outside with a notebook, writing down the principles I wanted to live by. My money would be a tool for living, not a shield for other people's bad decisions. My time would only go where respect lived. My silence would no longer mean approval. And most of all, my kindness would never again require my disappearance. People think freedom comes with noise, with declarations and fireworks. But real release is quiet. It doesn't look like revenge or victory. It looks like peace. Like a woman sitting on her porch, listening to the sea, and realizing she doesn't have to fix anyone to be whole. The family's empire had fallen apart, but I wasn't watching. I didn't need to. The collapse wasn't my failure. It was gravity, long delayed. They would rebuild or they wouldn't, but that was no longer my story. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I opened the door, turned on the soft lamp beside the couch, and made a simple dinner. I didn't check my phone. I didn't think about who might be calling. I fell asleep to the sound of waves brushing against stone and woke the next morning to a sky that looked like a blank page waiting to be written. That was the real ending. Not revenge. Release. A house that finally felt like mine. Money that served a life instead of defining it. A name that belonged to a woman who could give without erasing herself. America is wide and full of places to begin again. I had found one. And when I stepped outside into the salt air that morning, I knew, this time, I wasn't running away. I was walking home.